Stop right there, you tomato-squishing varmint. This is a high-stakes produce standoff.
The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists as Detective Morrison shoved him against the squad car, crushing the Cherokee purple tomato seedlings he'd been watering moments before. "You have the right to remain silent," Morrison barked, his knee pressing into the small of the man's back. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." Neighbors lined their pristine driveways, smartphones raised like weapons, recording every second of his humiliation. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down actually smiled as she filmed her manicured lawn, a testament to the HOA's iron grip on Meadowbrook Estates. "This is insane," he gasped, dirt from his garden grinding into his khakis as Morrison forced him lower. "They're tomatoes. I have every legal right. Tell it to the judge, pal." Morrison's voice dripped with contempt. "Illegal farming operations, code violations, disturbing the peace. Your neighbors are tired of your little agricultural experiment." The HOA president, Richard Caldwell, emerged from his McMansion across the street, clipboard in hand, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the morning chaos. He approached with the self-satisfied stride of a man who'd just won a war. "Officer, I want to press charges for property damage as well," Caldwell announced, gesturing toward the scattered soil and broken stakes. "This display has negatively impacted our property values by an estimated 12% according to our latest assessment. You can't be serious." The words came out as a whisper, disbelief coating every syllable. "You called the police because I planted vegetables in my own front yard." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "This is a residential community with standards, not some third-world farm plot. We have rules here, and people like you seem to think you're above them." The phrase hung in the air like poison. "People like you." Morrison hauled him upright, and for a split second, their eyes met. The detective's gaze flickered with something recognition. Uncertainty, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Caldwell's been tracking your little operation for months," Morrison said, shoving him toward the car door. "Photographic evidence, neighbor complaints, the whole 9 yards. You picked the wrong neighborhood to play farmer." As the squad car door slammed shut, trapping him inside with the scent of industrial disinfectant and stale coffee, he caught sight of his reflection. In the window, dirt streaked his face, his university t-shirt was torn at the collar, and his hands that had once shaken with world leaders at agricultural summits were now zip-tied behind his back. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. Dr. Samuel Chen, the man who'd revolutionized sustainable farming across 3 continents, who'd been featured on the cover of Agricultural Science Monthly just last year, was being arrested for growing tomatoes in his own front yard. The same hands that had developed the Chen-modified root system, a breakthrough that increased crop yields by 40% in drought conditions, were now being treated like those of a common criminal. But what burned most was the look in Caldwell's eyes. It wasn't just about code violations or property values. This was personal. This was about power, control, and something darker that Chen was only beginning to understand. That as the squad car pulled away from Meadowbrook Estates, Chen stared back at his modest corner lot. The Cherokee purples lay scattered and broken, their roots exposed to the harsh morning sun. But in the back corner of his yard, barely visible from the street, the real experiment continued. Rows of carefully cultivated plants that represented 5 years of research into climate-resistant agriculture. Plants that certain people would kill to claim as their own. Judge Harrison Whitmore's gavel came down like a guillotine blade, and Chen felt the sound reverberate through his chest. The arraignment hearing had the atmosphere of a medieval trial. All that was missing were torches and pitchforks. The defendant stands accused of multiple violations of Municipal Code 47B. Agricultural operations in residential zones, Whitmore intoned, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. "How do you plead?" Chen's attorney, a tired-looking woman named Janet Walsh, stood awkwardly beside him. She'd been assigned to his case 30 minutes before the hearing began, and her knowledge of the situation could fit on a post-it note. "Your Honor," Walsh began hesitantly, "my client maintains his innocence. The cultivation of personal vegetables for family consumption is protected under Ms. Walsh." Whitmore's interruption was sharp as a blade. "Are you familiar with the Meadowbrook Estates HOA covenant agreements? Section 12 explicitly prohibits any agricultural activities that may impact the aesthetic harmony of the community." Chen stepped forward, his restraint finally snapping. "Your Honor, with respect, I'm growing tomatoes, not operating a commercial farm. The law clearly states the defendant will remain silent unless directly addressed by this court." Whitmore's eyes were ice cold, and Chen recognized the look immediately, the same one he'd seen in boardrooms across the world, when executives realized they were dealing with someone who didn't fit their preconceptions. District Attorney Patricia Vance, rose from the prosecution table, her suit immaculate, her presentation flawless. Chen had researched her during his one phone call. She was up for re-election in 6 months, and her campaign centered on protecting suburban family values. Your Honor, this case represents something far more serious than simple code violations, Vance declared, her voice carrying theatrical weight. The defendant has repeatedly ignored official warnings, continued his illegal operations despite formal complaints, and has shown complete disregard for the community standards that make Meadowbrook Estates one of our county's premier residential areas. She gestured toward a poster board displaying photographs of Chen's front yard garden. In the harsh flash photography, his carefully tended plants looked wild, chaotic, almost threatening. These images were taken over a 6-month period, documenting the progressive deterioration of neighborhood standards. Property values in the immediate vicinity have declined by an average of 8% since the defendant began his agricultural experiment. Chen's jaw clenched. Every word was calculated, designed to paint him as a threat to suburban tranquility. But what truly galled him was the obvious coordination between Vance, Whitmore, and Caldwell, who sat in the front row of the gallery, like a proud father at his child's graduation. Furthermore, Vance continued, the defendant has shown no willingness to comply with reasonable community standards. When approached by HOA representatives, he became belligerent and made threats. That's a lie, Chen said, his voice cutting through the courtroom's artificial stillness. Whitmore's gavel crashed down again. The defendant will be silent, or I'll hold him in contempt. But Chen had spent too many years in conference rooms with corporate executives and government officials to be intimidated by a small-town judge's theatrics. I never threatened anyone. I asked for documentation of the specific violations, which they refused to provide. I requested copies of the relevant HOA bylaws, which they claimed were proprietary information. When I consulted with legal counsel about my rights as a property owner, suddenly I'm arrested for disturbing the peace. The courtroom went dead silent. Even Vance seemed momentarily taken aback by his articulate response. Whitmore's face flushed red. Mr. Chen, is it? You seem to have some difficulty understanding how things work in our community. This isn't some academic debate. This is a court of law, and you've broken the law. The emphasis on his name was subtle but unmistakable. Chen had heard that tone before in university faculty meetings when he was the only non-white professor in the room. In research symposiums when colleagues questioned whether his innovations were really his own work. Your Honor, Walsh interjected, finally finding her voice. I'd like to request a continuance to properly review the case materials, and denied. Whitmore didn't even look at her. This case is straightforward. The defendant violated clearly established community standards, ignored official warnings, and continued his illegal activities. Bail is set at $50,000. The number hit Chen like a physical blow. $50,000 for growing tomatoes in his own yard, an amount specifically calculated to ensure he'd remain in custody. Your Honor, that's excessive for a code violation case. Walsh protested. The defendant has shown clear disregard for authority and community standards, Whitmore replied. He's a flight risk, and frankly, this court has concerns about his ability to comply with any conditions of release. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Chen turned toward the gallery. Caldwell's satisfied smile was the last thing he saw before being led away. But something else caught his attention, a young woman in the back row, frantically taking notes. She looked familiar, though he couldn't place her face. The holding cell smelled of industrial disinfectant and despair. As Chen sat on the metal bench, his mind raced through the obvious orchestration of his arrest and arraignment. The timing, the excessive bail, the judge's clear bias, none of it was accidental. But what he couldn't understand was why. What was so threatening about a few tomato plants that it warranted this level of coordinated response? The answer, he suspected, had everything to do with Richard Caldwell and nothing to do with community standards. The law office of Martinez and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the city's legal district. Its exposed brick walls and industrial lighting, a stark contrast to the corporate sterility of the courthouse. Alina Martinez herself was equally unconventional, former public defender who'd built her practice on cases that bigger firms wouldn't touch. $50,000 bail for tomatoes, she said, reviewing Chen's case file. Either you're growing the world's most dangerous vegetables, or someone really wants you to disappear for a while. Chen shifted in the uncomfortable metal chair across from her desk. My colleague Dr. Williams recommended you. She said you specialized in cases involving systemic abuse of power. Dr. Williams from the university's Agricultural Sciences Department. Martinez's eyebrow arched. She mentioned you might be calling. Said you were probably the most overqualified defendant in county history. For the first time in 48 hours. Chen allowed himself a small smile. Dr. Williams has a tendency toward hyperbole. Does she? Martinez pulled up something on her computer screen. Because according to this, you're Dr. Samuel Chen, developer of the Chen Modified Root System, consultant to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and recipient of the International Award for Sustainable Innovation. You've literally fed millions of people with your agricultural research. The irony of the situation hit Chen again like a physical weight, and now I'm in jail for growing 6 tomato plants in my front yard. Martinez leaned back in her chair, studying him with the intensity of a prosecutor examining evidence. Dr. Chen, in my experience, when the punishment doesn't fit the crime, it's because the crime isn't really the crime. Someone wants you silenced, discredited, or removed. The question is why. She opened a thick folder and spread photographs across her desks, surveillance images of Chen's property taken from multiple angles over several months. Your HOA president, Richard Caldwell, has been documenting your gardening activities with the thoroughness of a federal investigation. These photos show timestamps, weather conditions, even measurements of plant growth. This isn't casual neighbor complaint territory, this is obsessive. Chen studied the images, noting details he'd missed during his brief court appearance. Some of these were taken from inside my yard. He was trespassing. Gets better. Martinez pulled up another document on her laptop. Caldwell owns Meadowbrook Landscaping Solutions, a company that specializes in premium residential agricultural consulting. His client list includes half the developments in the county, and he's been pitching municipal contracts for sustainable community gardening initiatives. The pieces started falling into place in Chen's mind. He's trying to monetize sustainable agriculture, frying being the operative phrase. His company's financial records show massive losses over the past 2 years. Turns out, wealthy suburbanites aren't willing to pay premium prices for vegetables they can buy at the grocery store. Martinez's smile was sharp. But what if someone with legitimate expertise validated his approach? Someone with international credentials who could legitimize his business model. Chen felt the blood drain from his face. He approached me 6 months ago. Wanted to discuss a consulting partnership for his landscaping business. I turned him down. Why? Because his methods were fundamentally flawed. He was using techniques that actually reduce soil quality over time. I told him his approach was unsustainable and would damage the properties he was trying to improve. Martinez nodded grimly. So he couldn't buy your endorsement. Plan B was to discredit you publicly and steal your research methods while you're tied up in legal proceedings. She pulled out another set of documents, patent applications filed with the U.S. Patent Office over the past year. Richard Caldwell has filed for patents on innovative residential agricultural techniques that bear a striking resemblance to your published research. The applications are currently under review, but if they're approved while you're fighting criminal charges, he could claim credit for 5 years of my research. Chun's hands clenched into fists. The root modification techniques I developed aren't just academic exercises. They represent millions of dollars in potential agricultural improvements. And if an internationally respected scientist is simultaneously being prosecuted for illegal farming, it raises questions about the legitimacy of his work. Martinez closed the folder. Dr. Chen, you're not being prosecuted for growing tomatoes. You're being prosecuted because your tomatoes prove that Caldwell's entire business model is fraudulent. The room fell silent as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Chen had been targeted not despite his expertise, but because of it. There's something else, Martinez continued. Judge Whitmore's financial disclosures show that he owns property in 3 different HOA communities, all managed by companies that Caldwell consults for, and Devance received a significant campaign contribution from the Meadowbrook Community Development Fund last year, a fund that Caldwell controls. Through a series of shell companies, yes. Martinez's expression grew grim. Dr. Chen, you're fighting more than an HOA code violation. You're fighting a coordinated effort to destroy your reputation while stealing your life's work. Chen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, his research was being perverted by a man whose only innovation was figuring out how to weaponize the legal system against someone who threatened his fraudulent business model. What do we do? He asked. Martinez's smile was predatory. We prove that the most dangerous thing growing in Meadowbrook Estates isn't your tomatoes. It's the corruption that's taken root in the courthouse. 18 months earlier, the conference room at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization headquarters in Rome hummed with quiet conversation as delegates from 47 nations reviewed the preliminary findings. Dr. Samuel Chen stood at the front of the room, a laser pointer in his hand, addressing an audience that included ministers of agriculture, heads of international aid organizations, and representatives from the world's largest agricultural corporations. The Chen modified root system represents a paradigm shift in sustainable agriculture, he explained, clicking to a slide showing side-by-side comparisons of traditional crops versus his modified varieties. In field tests across 6 different climate zones, we've achieved an average yield increase of 43% while reducing water consumption by 60%. The Pakistani Minister of Agriculture leaned forward. Dr. Chen, these results suggest we could transform food security across South Asia. What's the timeline for widespread implementation? The technique is scalable immediately, Chen replied. Unlike genetic modification, this approach works with existing seed varieties through soil conditioning and root training methods. A farming community could implement these changes in a single growing season. After the presentation, Chen found himself surrounded by delegates eager to discuss implementation in their home countries. But it was the conversation with Dr. Elena Vasquez from the World Bank that would prove most significant. Samuel, she said, pulling him aside, what you've accomplished here could literally feed the world. But I have to ask, have you considered the commercial implications? Chen frowned. What do you mean? Agricultural corporations are going to want to monetize this research. Patent the techniques, license the methods, control the distribution. You need to protect your work. Dr. Vasquez, the whole point of this research is to make sustainable agriculture accessible to communities that need it most. I'm not interested in corporate partnerships that restrict access. She studied his face carefully. Samuel, you're brilliant, but you're naive about how the agricultural industry operates. If you don't protect your research, someone else will steal it and lock it behind corporate paywalls. At least if you control the patents, you can ensure ethical distribution. Chen had dismissed her concerns at the time, focused on the humanitarian applications of his work. But as he sat in Martinez's office reviewing Caldwell's patent applications, Dr. Vasquez's warning echoed in his mind with devastating clarity. Present day. You never filed patents on your core research methods? Martinez asked, incredulous. I published everything in open access journals. Chen replied, the point was to make the information freely available to farmers and agricultural researchers worldwide, which means Caldwell could file patents claiming to have invented techniques you developed and published years ago. Chen nodded grimly. In patent law, publication doesn't always prevent someone else from filing for improvements or applications of the basic research. If Caldwell can demonstrate that his specific implementation methods are novel, he could own the commercial rights to your life's work. Martinez shook her head. Dr. Chen, your generosity may have created the perfect opportunity for intellectual theft. She pulled up another document on her laptop, a promotional brochure for Meadowbrook Landscaping Solutions. Look at this marketing material. Caldwell is advertising revolutionary agricultural techniques developed through years of proprietary research. The techniques described are nearly identical to your published methods, but he's claiming original development. Chen studied the brochure, noting how Caldwell had carefully reworded his research to avoid direct plagiarism while still appropriating the core innovations. There's more, Martinez continued. I've been researching Caldwell's background. He has no formal education in agriculture or plant sciences. His previous business was residential construction until that went bankrupt 3 years ago. He rebranded as a landscaping consultant right around the time your research started gaining international attention. The pattern was becoming clear. Had identified Chen's work as an opportunity for reinvention, but needed to eliminate the original researcher to avoid accusations of theft. The timing of your arrest isn't coincidental, Martinez explained. Caldwell's patent applications are scheduled for final review next month. If they're approved while you're fighting criminal charges, he becomes the recognized innovator of techniques that you actually developed. Chen felt a familiar anger building, the same fury he'd experienced in academic settings when colleagues questioned whether his research was really his own work. When corporate executives assumed he was just the frontman for some larger, presumably, white research team. There's something else, Martinez continued. I've been in contact with some of your former colleagues. Dr. Williams mentioned that you've received multiple offers from agricultural corporations over the years. Offers worth millions of dollars that you've consistently refused. I told you, I'm not interested in commercializing research that could help feed hungry people. I understand that. But what if I told you that Caldwell has been in negotiations with AgriCorp International for the past 6 months, trying to sell them the rights to his sustainable agriculture techniques? The name hit Chen like a physical blow. AgriCorp International was one of the largest agricultural conglomerates in the world, and they'd been trying to acquire his research for years. Through increasingly aggressive offers, if Caldwell's patents are approved, Martinez continued, he'll have the legal standing to sell AgriCorp the exclusive rights to techniques that could revolutionize global agriculture. We're not just talking about your front yard garden anymore, talking about control over food security for millions of people. Chen stood and walked to the window again, processing the full scope of what he was facing. His arrest for growing tomatoes was just the opening move in a much larger game, one where the stakes were measured not in property values or community standards, but in the fundamental question of who would control the future of sustainable agriculture. Dr. Chen Martinez said quietly, "You thought you were fighting for the right to grow vegetables in your yard, but you're actually fighting for the right to prevent your life's work from being stolen and locked away by corporate interests." He turned back to face her, and Martinez saw something new in his expression, not just anger, but the focused determination of a man who finally understood what he was really fighting for. "What do we need to prove our case? Evidence of the conspiracy, documentation of the intellectual theft, and proof that your arrest was orchestrated to facilitate that theft." Martinez's smile was grim. "Fortunately, Dr. Chen, people who are corrupt enough to steal your research are usually sloppy enough to leave a trail." The break came from an unexpected source. A flash drive slipped under Martinez's office door at 3 a.m. by someone who left no other trace of their identity. The drive contained over 200 files, emails, financial records, recorded phone conversations, and internal documents from both Caldwell's landscaping business and the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Martinez and Chen spent the next 12 hours reviewing the contents, and what they found exceeded their worst suspicions. "Jesus," Martinez muttered, reading an email chain between Caldwell and Judge Whitmore. "They're not even trying to hide it." The correspondence, dating back 8 months, revealed a detailed plan to address the Chen problem through coordinated legal harassment. Whitmore had provided Caldwell with specific information about which code violations would result in criminal charges versus civil penalties, while Caldwell had documented Chen's gardening activities with law enforcement level detail. But the smoking gun was a recorded phone conversation between Caldwell and AgriCorp's vice president of acquisitions, dated just 2 weeks before Chen's arrest. "The patents should be approved by the end of next month." Caldwell's voice was clear on the recording. "Once we eliminate the credibility issue with the original researcher, AgriCorp will have exclusive access to the most revolutionary agricultural techniques of the past decade, and you're certain Chen won't be a problem." The corporate executive's voice was cautious. "Trust me, by the time we're done with him, Dr. Samuel Chen's reputation will be so damaged that no one will believe he developed these techniques in the first place. Academic fraud, illegal agricultural operations, contempt for community standards. We're building a narrative that makes him look like a dangerous eccentric, rather than a legitimate scientist." Chen felt sick listening to his character assassination being planned with the casual efficiency of a business meeting. "There's more," Martinez said, pulling up financial records. "Look at these payment records." The documents showed a series of transfers from Caldwell's business accounts to a legal fund that had been used to pay for community legal expenses, including a significant contribution to DA Patricia Vance's re-election campaign. "They bought themselves a prosecutor," Chen said quietly, "and a judge. Look at this." Martinez displayed property records showing that Whitmore had purchased a vacation home in a development managed by one of Caldwell's shell companies at below market value. But the most damaging evidence was a series of internal memos from Caldwell's landscaping business, outlining a systematic plan to appropriate Chen's research methods and present them as original innovations. One memo, marked Confidential Patent Strategy, was particularly explicit. "The Chen research provides the foundation for our sustainable agriculture division, but we need to establish independent development of these techniques. Recommend documenting experimental trials predating Chen's published research, using modified terminology to avoid direct plagiarism accusations. Key is to establish proprietary claim before Chen's academic status allows him to challenge our patents." "They've been planning this for almost a year," Martinez said. "Your arrest wasn't an impulsive response to your garden. It was the culmination of a coordinated campaign to steal your research and destroy your credibility." Chen studied the documents with growing horror. "The level of detail here. They've been surveilling me, analyzing my research, planning my destruction. All for agricultural techniques that I've freely published for humanitarian purposes." "Dr. Chen, this goes beyond intellectual property theft. Look at this email from Caldwell to the HOA board." The message, sent just days before Chen's arrest, was chilling in its casual bigotry. "The Chen situation has escalated beyond simple code violations. This individual represents exactly the kind of diversity that threatens our community standards. His refusal to comply with reasonable regulations, combined with his foreign agricultural practices, suggests a fundamental incompatibility with American suburban values. I recommend we pursue all available legal remedies to address this situation permanently. The phrase foreign agricultural practices burned like acid. Chen had been born in California, educated at American universities, and had spent his entire career improving food security for communities around the world. But to Caldwell, his expertise was automatically suspect because of his ethnicity. This is evidence of discriminatory prosecution, Martinez said. They're not just stealing your research, they're using racial bias to justify destroying your life. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was a series of communications between Caldwell and other HOA presidents across the county, sharing strategies for managing problematic residents through coordinated legal harassment. Dr. Chen, you're not their first victim, Martinez explained. This network has been targeting homeowners who don't fit their demographic preferences, using code violations and legal harassment to force them out of their communities. The documents revealed a pattern of systematic discrimination disguised as community standards, enforcement targeting families with different cultural practices, professionals whose work didn't fit suburban norms, and anyone whose presence challenged the homogeneous character of these exclusive developments. They've turned HOA governance into a weapon for ethnic cleansing, Chen said, his voice hollow, and they've corrupted the legal system to make it work, Martinez replied. Judges who own property in their developments, prosecutors who depend on their campaign contributions, police departments that respond to their complaints without investigation. As they compiled the evidence, Chen realized that his case represented something much larger than personal injustice. The conspiracy that had targeted him was part of a broader assault on diversity, innovation, and the fundamental principle that expertise and contribution should matter more than conformity to arbitrary social expectations. What happens now? He asked. Martinez's smile was grim and determined. Now we expose the whole rotten system, and we make sure that everyone who participated in this conspiracy faces the consequences of their actions. She began organizing the evidence in default: conspiracy, intellectual property theft, discriminatory prosecution, judicial corruption, campaign finance violations. Dr. Chen, when we walk into that courtroom tomorrow, we're not just fighting for your right to grow tomatoes. We're fighting to prove that justice can't be bought, that expertise can't be stolen, and that no one, regardless of their power or connections, is above the law. Chen looked at the mountain of evidence spread across Martinez's desk, documentation of a conspiracy that had tried to destroy his life and steal his work. But for the first time since his arrest, he felt something approaching hope. Tomorrow, the truth would finally have its day in court. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with reporters lining the walls and spectators spilling into the hallway. Word of the evidence Martinez had uncovered had leaked to the press, transforming a simple code violation hearing into what local media was calling the trial of the decade. Judge Whitmore entered, looking like a man walking to his own execution, his usual arrogant composure replaced by visible anxiety. He avoided eye contact with anyone in the gallery, particularly the federal investigators who'd taken seats in the front row after Martinez's evidence had been forwarded to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. DA Patricia Vance looked equally uncomfortable, her political instincts undoubtedly screaming that this case had become radioactive to her re-election chances. Your Honor, Martinez began, rising with a thick folder of documents. Before we proceed with the defendant's case, I need to address some irregularities that have come to light regarding the prosecution of Dr. Chen. Whitmore's face went pale. Ms. Martinez, this is a simple municipal code violation case. I don't see how, Your Honor, with respect. This case stopped being simple the moment it became part of a criminal conspiracy to steal intellectual property and engage in discriminatory prosecution. Martinez's voice carried across the packed courtroom with perfect clarity. She approached the bench with a manila envelope. I'm filing a motion to dismiss all charges against Dr. Chen based on prosecutorial misconduct, judicial bias, and violation of his civil rights under the 14th Amendment. Vance shot to her feet. Objection. This is a transparent attempt to derail legitimate criminal proceedings with wild conspiracy theories. Ms. Vance, Martinez interrupted. Are you familiar with the recording of your phone conversation with Richard Caldwell, where you discussed strategies for neutralizing Chen's credibility in exchange for continued campaign contributions? The courtroom erupted. Reporters frantically scribbled notes while spectators turned to each other in shocked whispers. Vance's face went ashen as she realized her carefully constructed prosecution was collapsing in real time. Martinez activated a small speaker on the defense table. Your Honor, I'd like to play Exhibit A1 for the court. Caldwell's voice filled the courtroom. The patents should be approved by the end of next month. Once we eliminate the credibility issue with the original researcher, AgriCorp will have exclusive access to the most revolutionary agricultural techniques of the past decade. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several spectators gasped audibly, while Judge Whitmore looked like he was fighting the urge to flee the courtroom. This recording, Martinez continued, is from a conversation between HOA President Richard Caldwell and AgriCorp International, discussing their plan to steal Dr. Chen's agricultural research by destroying his reputation through false criminal charges. She gestured toward Chen, who sat with quiet dignity despite the chaos around him. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Samuel Chen is not a criminal. He's one of the world's leading experts in sustainable agriculture, whose research has improved food security for millions of people across 6 continents. The illegal agricultural operation he's accused of running consists of 6 tomato plants in his front yard, plants that represent 5 years of research into climate-resistant crops. Martinez pulled out the patent applications and held them high. While Dr. Chen sits in jail, Richard Caldwell has filed patents claiming to have invented the agricultural techniques that Dr. Chen developed and published in peer-reviewed journals years ago. The timing of Dr. Chen's arrest was specifically calculated to prevent him from challenging this intellectual property theft. From the gallery, Caldwell attempted to leave, but found his path blocked by federal agents who had quietly positioned themselves at the exits. Furthermore, Martinez continued, producing the email evidence. This conspiracy extends beyond simple theft. Mr. Caldwell's communications reveal a systematic pattern of targeting residents who don't conform to his racial and cultural preferences, using HOA enforcement as a weapon for ethnic cleansing. She read from one of Caldwell's emails. His foreign agricultural practices suggest a fundamental incompatibility with American suburban values. Dr. Chen was born in California, educated at Stanford and UC Davis, and has spent his career serving American agricultural interests abroad. But to Mr. Caldwell, his expertise was automatically suspect because of his ethnicity. Judge Whitmore made a final desperate attempt to maintain control. Ms. Martinez, these allegations are serious, but they don't change the fact that the defendant violated clearly established. Your Honor, Martinez interrupted, producing the financial records. Are you referring to the community standards established by the same Richard Caldwell, who paid for your vacation home at 40% below market value? Or perhaps the standards enforced by D.A. Vance, whose campaign received significant contributions from shell companies controlled by Mr. Caldwell? The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the reporters stopped writing. Stunned by the scope of corruption being revealed in real time, Martinez turned to address the gallery, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone speaking absolute truth. This case represents everything wrong with our justice system. The weaponization of law enforcement against expertise and diversity, the corruption of judicial proceedings by financial interests, and the systematic theft of intellectual property from researchers whose only crime was trying to help feed the world. She gestured toward Chen again. Dr. Chen's crime was developing agricultural techniques so effective that corporate interests were willing to corrupt an entire legal system to steal them. His punishment for refusing to commercialize humanitarian research was to have his character assassinated and his freedom taken away. From the back of the courtroom, a voice called out, "Dr. Chen." Everyone turned to see Dr. Elena Vasquez from the World Bank. Accompanied by 2 officials from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, Dr. Chen, Dr. Vasquez continued, "The international agricultural community has been following your case with great concern. We're here to testify about the significance of your research and the humanitarian impact of the techniques that certain parties have attempted to appropriate." Martinez smiled. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Dr. Elena Vasquez as a character witness for the defense." But before Whitmore could respond, federal agents moved toward the bench. "Your Honor," the lead agent announced, "I have warrants for the arrest of Richard Caldwell, Patricia Vance, and Harrison Whitmore on charges of conspiracy, corruption, and violation of civil rights under color of law." The courtroom exploded into chaos as handcuffs clicked shut around Whitmore's wrists, the same sound that had marked the beginning of Chen's nightmare. Just days earlier, as the disgraced judge was led away, Chen felt a profound sense of vindication. Mixed with exhaustion, the weight of fighting a system designed to crush him had taken its toll. But seeing justice finally served provided a measure of peace he hadn't felt in months. An emergency hearing was immediately convened with Judge Patricia Morrison presiding, a respected jurist with no connections to the conspiracy. Within 30 minutes, all charges against Chen were dismissed with prejudice, and he was formally exonerated of any wrongdoing. But the real victory came when Dr. Vasquez took the stand to testify about Chen's contributions to global food security. Dr. Chen's research has been implemented in 47 countries, she explained to the packed courtroom. His techniques have increased crop yields for over 2 million small-scale farmers, preventing famine in regions affected by climate change, The economic value of his innovations exceeds $2 billion annually in increased agricultural productivity. She looked directly at Chen with obvious respect. In the international scientific community, Dr. Samuel Chen is considered one of the most important agricultural researchers of his generation. The idea that such a man would be prosecuted for growing tomatoes in his yard would be laughable if it weren't so deeply troubling. Martinez stood for her final statement. Your Honor, this case has revealed a conspiracy that strikes at the heart of American values, the belief that innovation and expertise should be rewarded, not punished. Dr. Chen's only crime was being too successful at helping others, too generous with his knowledge, and too principled to commercialize research that could help feed hungry people. She gestured toward the federal agents escorting Caldwell from the courtroom. The real criminals are those who tried to steal his work, corrupt our legal system, and use racial bias to justify their actions. Today, justice has been served, but we must remain vigilant against those who would weaponize our institutions, against the very people who make our communities stronger. 6 months later, Dr. Samuel Chen stood in his front yard, surveying the lush garden that had become a symbol of resistance against suburban tyranny. The Cherokee purple tomatoes were thriving, their deep purple fruit hanging heavy on the vine. But they were no longer alone. His front yard now hosted a demonstration plot featuring dozens of varieties of climate-resistant crops, each carefully labeled with scientific names and growing instructions. The transformation of Meadowbrook Estates had been swift and dramatic. Caldwell's arrest had triggered a federal investigation into HOA governance practices across the county, resulting in 17 additional indictments for conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations. The Meadowbrook model of discriminatory enforcement had been exposed as a criminal enterprise, masquerading as community management. Martinez joined him in the garden, carrying a thick folder of legal documents. The Patent Office has officially invalidated all of Caldwell's applications, she announced. They've also flagged his filings as an example of fraudulent intellectual property theft for future examiners. Chen nodded, picking a ripe tomato and examining its perfect form. What about AgriCorp, facing their own federal investigation for conspiracy to acquire stolen intellectual property? Their stock price has dropped 30% since the scandal broke. Martinez smiled grimly. Turns out corporate America doesn't appreciate being associated with suburban racism and judicial corruption. The legal aftermath had been swift and comprehensive. Judge Whitmore was facing 20 years in federal prison for corruption and civil rights violations. DA Patricia Vance had resigned in disgrace and was under investigation for campaign finance violations. The entire HOA board had been dissolved and replaced with court-appointed administrators, committed to actual community service rather than demographic control. But the most satisfying outcome was the establishment of the Chen Agricultural Research Center, funded by a coalition of international organizations and agricultural universities. Located on 5 acres adjacent to Chen's property, the center would serve as a demonstration site for sustainable farming techniques and a training facility for farmers from developing countries. Dr. Chen, Martinez said, "You've turned a personal injustice into a global victory for agricultural innovation." Chen picked another tomato. This one, an experimental variety that could thrive in drought conditions, while producing 60% more fruit than traditional plants. The irony is that Caldwell's conspiracy actually helped spread awareness of sustainable agriculture techniques. The media coverage reached more farmers than any academic journal ever could. A car pulled into the driveway, and Dr. Elena Vasquez emerged, accompanied by several officials from various international agricultural organizations. They were here for the grand opening of the research center, but also to discuss Chen's newest project, a global network of demonstration gardens in suburban communities, proving that sustainable agriculture could thrive even in the most regulated residential environments. Samuel, Dr. Vasquez called out, "The UN Secretary General asked me to extend his personal congratulations. Your case has sparked policy discussions about protecting agricultural innovation from corporate appropriation." As the group toured Chen expanded garden, pointing out various experimental plants and discussing their applications in different climate zones, a small crowd of neighbors gathered to watch. These were new faces, the diverse community that had moved into Meadowbrook Estates after the discriminatory enforcement practices had been eliminated. Mrs. Chen emerged from the house, carrying a tray of refreshments, her proud smile reflecting the vindication her family had experienced. Their teenage daughter followed, wearing a t-shirt that read, "My dad feeds the world," in multiple languages. Dr. Chen called out James Rodriguez, a new neighbor who taught environmental science at the local high school. "My students are fascinated by your research. Would you consider giving a presentation about sustainable agriculture?" Of course, Chen replied, but I have a better idea. Why don't we start a community garden project? Your students could help design and maintain demonstration plots for different crop varieties. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval from the growing crowd of neighbors. Within minutes, plans were being made to convert the common areas of Meadowbrook Estates into educational gardens, showcasing sustainable farming techniques. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his yard, Chen reflected on the journey. From his arrest to this moment of community celebration, the conspiracy against him had been designed to silence his voice and steal his work, but instead it had amplified his message and created a platform for even broader impact. His phone buzzed with a text message from Martinez. Federal jury just convicted Caldwell on all counts, 15 years in prison, plus full restitution for attempted intellectual property theft. Justice served. Chen smiled and deleted the message. Justice had indeed been served, but more importantly, the principles that had guided his career, that knowledge should be shared, that expertise should be respected, and that innovation should serve humanity rather than corporate interests had been vindicated. The Cherokee purple tomatoes continued to ripen in the fading light, their deep color a testament to the power of persistence, principle, and the simple act of planting seeds in fertile ground. What had begun as a man's right to grow vegetables in his own yard had evolved into a movement that would feed communities around the world. In the end, the most subversive act in suburban America wasn't growing tomatoes in your front yard. It was refusing to let fear, prejudice, and corruption prevent you from sharing your gifts with the world. As the neighbors dispersed and the international visitors departed, Chen remained in his garden, tending to plants that represented more than agricultural innovation. They were symbols of resistance, hope, and the enduring power of truth to overcome even the most elaborate conspiracies. The seeds of justice, once planted, would continue growing long after the last tomato had been harvested. The END. 3 years later, Samuel Chen's story had become a case study in law schools across the country, illustrating how ordinary citizens could challenge systemic corruption through evidence, persistence, and moral courage. The Meadowbrook model was now taught as an example of how institutional racism could be disguised as community standards, and how corporate interests could corrupt local governance. The Chen Agricultural Research Center had become a pilgrimage site for sustainable farming advocates, hosting visitors from over 60 countries and training thousands of farmers in climate-resistant agriculture techniques. The demonstration gardens that had started in Chen's front yard had spread to over 200 communities nationwide, proving that sustainable food production could thrive even in the most unlikely suburban settings. Richard Caldwell was serving his 15-year sentence in federal prison. His landscaping empire dissolved and his stolen patents permanently invalidated. Judge Whitmore had been disbarred and was appealing his 20-year sentence from his own federal prison cell. Patricia Vance had fled to a non-extradition country after additional corruption charges were filed, but remained a wanted fugitive. But perhaps the most important outcome was the quiet revolution that had transformed suburban communities across America. HOA governance had been fundamentally reformed, with new federal oversight preventing the kind of discriminatory enforcement that had targeted Chen and hundreds of other residents. The right to grow food on private property had been enshrined in legislation known as the Chen Amendment, protecting agricultural activities from arbitrary community standards. And in a small corner of what had once been Meadowbrook Estates, Cherokee purple tomatoes continued to grow in the front yard of a modest house. Their deep color, a permanent reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought over the simplest things, like a person's right to plant seeds in their own soil and watch them grow toward the light.